Last summer, I decided to go camping by myself for the first time. I had always been into nature and thought spending time alone in the woods would be peaceful. I found a quiet spot far from any town and set up my tent beside a small creek. The trees were tall and close together, and it was so quiet you could hear every little sound. The first day was great. I hiked around, cooked over a fire, and just enjoyed being outside. But as night fell, the sky turned dark with clouds. Soon it started pouring rain. My tent wasn't holding up well. Water was getting in, and everything turned wet quickly. I need to find a better place to stay dry. With my flashlight in hand, I left the tent and wandered through the trees, trying to find any kind of shelter. After about 20 minutes, I saw something strange through the rain and fog. It was an old house, standing alone in the middle of the woods. It looked like no one had lived there for years. The paint was peeling, and one of the windows was broken. But it was better than my tent, so I decided to go inside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. It smelled musty and like dirt inside. I shined my flashlight around and saw some old furniture covered with dust and spiderwebs. I was definitely scared, but I didn't want to go all the way back to my wet campsite at this point. I made my way upstairs, careful on the creaky steps. There was a small room with an old bed that had a musty blanket on it. The room was pitch black and smelled horrible. As I laid my hiking gear down, I noticed some creepy looking dolls on the counter next to the bed. At this point, red flags were going off in my mind, and I knew I should have just left, but I was exhausted and decided just to stay for the night. I fell back onto the bed and tried to get some sleep. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of footsteps downstairs. They were slow and heavy. I held my breath, listening as the steps moved around the lower floor, then started coming up the stairs. I was terrified. Who could possibly be in this house in the middle of the woods with me? Quickly, I rolled off the bed and hid under it, pressing myself against the floor. The footsteps came down the hallway and stopped right outside the door. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. Then I saw it. Old, gross feet at the doorframe. It didn't have any shoes on. The skin was pale and dirty. Whoever this was had on an old, torn white dress as well. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying not to make a sound, even as tears ran down my cheeks. The woman outside whispered something, too soft to hear. My whole body was shaking. I could hear my own breathing loud in the silence, and I tried to quiet myself. I had never been that scared in my entire life. I thought she would never leave. After what felt like hours, the footsteps slowly moved away and the whispering stopped. I waited, counting to 100 in my head, not even thinking about moving until I was sure she was gone. As soon as I felt safe, I crawled out from under the bed and ran as fast as I could out of the house. Just as I ran out the front door, I heard a loud scream from behind me. It chilled me to the bone, but I didn't stop or look back. I ran all the way back to my campsite, quickly grabbed my wet gear, and hiked back to my car in the dark and rain. I didn't stop running for hours until I reached my car finally. I drove home that night, still shaking. I never found out who it was in that house or why, and I don't want to either. I don't know if I'll ever go camping alone again. That night in the woods, finding that house, was the most terrifying experience of my life. Be careful camping, everyone. Last summer, my friend Jacob and I took a trip to a remote lake we heard was perfect for camping. It was far from any town, surrounded by woods, and known for its peaceful setting. We were looking forward to a busy weekend of fishing and catching up with each other away from work. We arrived in the late afternoon to find the lake as beautiful as everyone always says. It was surrounded by dense trees, and there wasn't another soul in sight. We quickly set up our tents near the shore and got a campfire going as the sun began to set. After we unloaded everything, we caught a couple of fish and cooked them over the fire. We talked for hours about our college days at Alabama over some Miller Lights, our beer of choice back in the day. When the night fully set in, the stars above lit up our campground. We could even see the Milky Way across the sky. We were blasting some Luke Combs on my big JBL speaker and having some good laughs. After a few more hours of drinking, Jacob decided to turn it in early, but I wasn't quite ready to sleep. I wasn't too tired, and the night was just too nice to go in. I sat down on our big log by the campsite and enjoyed the peaceful night and the bright stars above. I hadn't gotten time to myself in a while, and it was just nice to hear the crickets chirping and the other sounds of the woods. After maybe 30 minutes, though, a thick fog came from across the lake and quickly covered our campsite. At this point, it was nearly impossible to see anything even just a few feet ahead of me, so I decided to head in. As I started to grab my beer and walk over to our tent, I heard something that still terrifies me to this day. A long, low moan that seemed to come from across the lake. It sounded like a girl's groan, but it was so low that I didn't even think it was possible for anyone to make that noise. It was maybe 50 to 100 feet away. It was the last noise I ever expected to hear in the middle of nowhere, and it absolutely horrified me. I rushed to our tent and woke Jacob up. He was half asleep and angry that I woke him, but after he saw how scared I was, he knew I wasn't joking. As he started to get up, we heard it again. This time it was louder, much closer too, as if it was just outside of the tent. Neither of us moved for a few minutes. As we sat there, we saw a shadow move across the outside of the tent. It looked tall and slim, and the noise followed with it. Whatever was out there definitely knew we were in here. For a minute, the shadow seemed to have gone away. Jacob and I both looked at each other, and we knew this was our only chance. We ran out of the tent as fast as we could, not even bothering with our flashlights. We both ran to the woods to get away from the sound. After a few minutes of running, we found a spot deep in the trees and stayed there, wide awake and listening. The groaning continued throughout the night, sounding like it was moving around our campsite. Neither of us got any sleep. By the time the morning came, the groans had stopped, but neither of us wanted to leave the safety of the woods. It was only when the sun was fully up and the fog had lifted that we dared to go back to the campsite. Around our tent were footprints coming from the lake, ones that we knew neither of us left. We packed up as quickly as we could, not even bothering to clean our gear. Threw everything in the car and drove away. It's been a few years since this happened. We've never spoken much about that night. It could have just been a kid messing with us, but I'm glad we didn't risk it. Either way, we learned our lesson. Some places are just better left unvisited. During the summer after my graduation, my old roommate, Derek, and I decided to hit a lesser-known trail for a weekend camping trip. It was called Old Pine Trail, notorious among local hikers for its dense forest and a chilling tale about a hiker who vanished without a trace years ago. We arrived late in the afternoon, with just enough light to set up camp next to an old, dried-up riverbed, surrounded by massive oak trees. Usually this is a busy season, but today there were no other tents in sight, which was strange. After setting up our tents and having a quick dinner, we sat by the fire, talking about job hunts and future plans. As darkness fell, the peaceful sounds of the woods kept us company, and I was really happy to be out here with my good friend. We both soon got tired and decided just to go to bed early. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps outside. Assuming it was Derek, I called out his name, but there was no response. Just the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. I unzipped my tent and looked out. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outline of our campsite, but not much beyond that. Derek's tent flap was closed, and after a moment, I convinced myself it was just a deer or some other animal. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to Derek, but he shrugged it off, joking about my crazy imagination. We spent the day hiking and returned to our site as the sun was setting. That night, after another round of stories by the fire, we went to our tents for sleep. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were heavier and closer. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened as they circled around our camp. Derek heard it too this time. I could hear him moving in his tent. Without warning, the footsteps stopped. The silence was even more terrifying. We both called out, asking who was there, but we, of course, got no response. Armed with our flashlights, we ventured out into the woods, scanning the tree line to see anything. That's when I saw him. A tall figure, standing just beyond the firelight, watching us from behind a massive oak tree. He was huge, wearing a dark hoodie, but his face was so hard to see. I was terrified, but I knew that now was not the time to act scared. I shouted at him to leave us alone, but he didn't move or respond. Derek picked up a large stick from the ground and said he was going to run over there and beat him up. That's when the man slowly turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing almost immediately. Neither of us could sleep after that. At dawn, we packed our gear as quickly as we could. Derek and I decided to go to the spot where the man was standing yesterday to see if we could find any hints about what his intentions were. We walked over to the same tree and noticed something terrifying. Scratch marks, like someone violently dug a knife into the bark, were everywhere on the tree. The feeling of being watched stayed with me until we were well away from the woods. Once back in Derek's car, we called our local ranger and told him about the incident. They told us there had been similar reports from other hikers in the area about a potential stalker, but nothing has ever come from their investigation. We were a bit disappointed, but there was not much else we could do, so we just left and went on with our lives. 1 year later, that same ranger called to give me an unexpected update. An older man had been found dead in the same part of the woods. They didn't know how long he had been there for, but they believed the stalker we saw was somehow connected to this case. To think that we were just a few feet away from potentially getting murdered is something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I'm grateful Derek was there to help me out.